Housing is unaffordable, energy is extremely expensive, mass migration is tearing the fabric of the country apart, the British are set to be a minority here within decades, and any semblance of culture that still exists here is just entirely subverted. Where Britishness is allowed to express itself, it's tamped down, and it's something that's framed as being shameful or wrong or evil or whatever, which is to say he is the leader of the right for all intents and purposes. And the fact that he's using that position not to build a movement, or rather the so-called movement he is building, to me seems quite superficial, because there's no philosophy or policy behind it or underpinning it. The fact that thus far that position has been not treated with the seriousness that I think it should be treated with, I don't know, it concerns me. I think the Troubles are going to look like a picnic compared to what's coming in the next 50 years in this country. And I don't say that with any degree of glee or joy. I just think that it's just the reality of the situation. And I think that if something isn't done in the next 10 years to seriously change the course of this country, I think something like mass civil unrest or indeed civil war is all but inevitable.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Peter Whittle. Now, my guest this week is somebody that you might have seen more and more on channels like GB News. Charlie Downes is a political strategist, broadcaster, and increasingly as well, writer, print journalist. He's with me today. Charlie, thanks very much for coming.
It's great to be here, Peter. Great to see you.
I wanted to start something really quite topical. You had a really good column in the Mail, Daily Mail, I think it was.
That's
this
right,
week.
yes.
Yeah. And it was basically about why you as a patriot would find it very hard to fight for Britain. And essentially you were speaking, I imagine, on behalf of quite a few people. What was your reasoning? What's behind that?
Well, thank you, first of all, for your very kind words. No. Peter, for my whole life, I've had the privilege of living in England. You know, I was born here, I grew up here, and knowingly or not, my parents immersed me in English culture from the day I was born. You know, holidays were always down to Cornwall to have roast dinners and eat scones and go to the beach and have picnics and go to parks and visit English heritage and National Trust sites and all the rest of it. And I don't think they did know what they were doing, but what they were doing was they were giving me a very, very deep-seated preference for my own culture and for my own people. And so when for example, this morning I was walking my dog, it was a beautiful sunny day through the fields near where I live, and I was just looking at this country, this inheritance that I have, and I was, every day it takes my breath away, the beauty that exists here. And I feel that way everywhere. I feel that way when I step into an Anglo-Saxon or Norman church and feel, the presence of my ancestors there in the walls and in the air and everything. In the pub, when you spend time among the English, among our countrymen, even just, walking through towns that have not yet been afflicted by the poison of multiculturalism and globalism. Just this experience that you are somewhere, somewhere real, somewhere with a real texture and an aesthetic to it. And so with that being said, if Britain was to be invaded, pretending for a moment that it hasn't been over the last few years with the hundreds of thousands of fighting-age males that have arrived on the shores of this country, I would take up arms and I would head to the front line, without a second thought. I would defend this land if it came to it, because it's my homeland and I love it. I love it more than anything. And the people here, I love them. But my column was about the prospect of conscription. And conscription to be sent abroad is
in relation to Ukraine.
Yes, indeed. Is a very, very different matter. Because what you're doing there is you're not fighting for England. You're not fighting for Britain.
Yes.
You're fighting for the interests of Britain's political class. And that's a very, very different set of interests. Yeah. These are, essentially, well, really it's American and British foreign policy interests that you would be fighting on behalf of. And that, to me, is such an insulting proposition that it almost leaves me speechless. Now, obviously, it hasn't left me speechless because I've written and spoken about it extensively over the last week. But when I think about what this political class that has governed us really for my entire life has done to this country, it just makes me furious. And when I say the political class, it's easy, I think, for those people who don't follow politics so closely to think purely of the public-facing elected element of government that we see in the Commons and on Question Time and on the television and all the rest of it. That's not what I'm talking about when I say the political class. I'm talking about the totality of the British state, from that very thin minority that is represented in the Commons, right the way through to the massive, unbelievably complex managerial state that exists beneath them, that actually carries out the day-to-day business of government. The state has expanded hugely, even in my lifetime. And has that made things better in this country? I wouldn't say so. I think that it's actually, on the contrary, made things less efficient, less effective, and actually less beautiful. This is a country now that feels like it's creaking under the weight of this enormous grey, it's what people call the blob, right? This immiserating superstructure that is on top of our society and crushing us, crushing down on us. And what has that political class done over the course of my lifetime? So I was born in 2001. I've never known a Britain that
makes you a Gen Z.
Gen Z, that's right. I'm 23 years old. Yeah. A child of post-revolutionary Britain. So I've never known Britain as anything other than a multicultural economic zone that's treated not as an ancient ancestral homeland, as I've spoken about already, but essentially as a balance sheet to be understood in terms of profit and loss. And where particularity exists, it's treated as an obstacle, as something to be overcome, something to be done away with, something to be ashamed of, actually. Because I remember going through the education system, the Blairite education system in the noughties and 2010s. For example, my historical education was very, very limited. I mean, insofar as we were educated about British history, really it was the Tudors and it was World War II. I mean, that's really the prevailing memory that I have of my primary and secondary education. And I think part of that is the reason that those two things stick with me so much is because the monarchs that governed Britain before we had what's today referred to as liberal democracy were presented as being, they were all Henry VIII's all the way down, mad kings who were, destructive and lascivious and crazy and all the rest of it. Yeah. And then World War II came along and completely reset what it means to be British, reset the idea of Britishness. And the moral paradigm that came into existence was one that was fundamentally liberal, wherein individual self-expression and self-actualization was held up as the ultimate moral good. And anything that goes against that is held up as being fundamentally evil.
Yes. Yeah.
And so, British particularity, British standards, the British sense of propriety and discipline goes against that, that liberal idea of individual self-expression. And so I was educated to believe that everything that it meant to be British up until 1945 was in some way backwards or wrong or to be ashamed of. When actually it was those things that built the modern world. It was those things that gave us so many of the things we do enjoy today.
Yeah. Yes. Hello. Please excuse this brief interruption, but I'd be really grateful if you could please hit the subscribe button and subscribe to our channel. Our mission is vitally important, and we must grow this channel to ensure that our content reaches the biggest possible audience. The best way to do this is for you to subscribe. It's totally free. And in addition to subscribing, if you're able to donate or join our membership scheme, please click on the link in the description or visit our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. We've got great plans ahead, but we can't do it without your support. From only £4 per month, you'll receive a range of perks and benefits, including exclusive content. Thank you. I mean, I think the other thing as well, just to go back to this thing of not fighting,
yes,
is this sort of sense in which, apart from many of us believing that the actual fight is really here, at the same time, it is, why would one fight for people who, quite rightly, you sense, don't even care about Britain?
Well, this is the point.
This blob you talk about.
As I say, there's been a number of policies, projects across my lifetime that have completely, utterly ruined this country, as far as I'm concerned. Principal among them being mass immigration and the demographic consequences that has and will have going into the future, with the British being projected as a minority in Britain in a matter of decades, which is an incredibly bleak and depressing and crushing prospect. Which is to say nothing of, for example, the climate policies, net zero, which has deindustrialized this country and made energy, which is the fundamental ingredient to a prosperous society, unaffordable. You know, it's massively increased the price of that. And just on the deindustrialization, I mean, that's been something that, as far as I'm concerned, has been in progress since Thatcher. Thatcher is held up as this kind of conservative hero. And certainly some of her solutions were appropriate for the time that she existed in. But the idea that what we need today is essentially reheated, lukewarm Thatcherism is just totally misguided as far as I'm concerned. Because what has Thatcherism, the project of neoliberal economics, done to this country? Well, it's left northern towns, completely without industry and without economic prosperity. Because, I mean, I don't know if you've been to Northern England recently.
Yes.
I was in Sheffield late last year. It's not somewhere that I've spent a huge amount of time because I grew up in the south and I've spent most of my life in the south, but I've spent some time in the north. And you go to some of these towns and it's just graffiti and litter and, strangers from, hither and yon, from all corners of the earth walking the streets. And you go there and it's like, what, is this good? Is this the outcome that the people who implemented these policies wanted? I'm prepared to say probably not. We'll give them the benefit of the doubt. But it's an incredibly bleak place, Britain, now. And that's what's so depressing. And so on the question of conscription, just to bring it back to this topic, the idea that someone like, someone my age, 23-year-old fighting age male, would be sent to somewhere like Ukraine on behalf of the political class that has done that to this country, and that I should be, there should be no question that I do that, is absurd. And so it's no surprise that so many young people would not take up arms for Britain, because 41% of under 30s, even if Britain were to be invaded, wouldn't take up arms for the country. And it's no surprise that that's the case, because if you look at the prospects offered to us right now, housing is unaffordable, energy is extremely expensive, mass migration is tearing the fabric of the country apart, the British are set to be a minority here within decades, and any semblance of culture that still exists here is just entirely subverted. Where Britishness is allowed to express itself, it's tamped down and it's something that's framed as being shameful or wrong or evil or whatever. And then the culture that is allowed to exist is essentially very, very thin American music or films or television or whatever else, whose morals, the moral kind of, the moral paradigm that it pushes, the moral system and the set of morals that it seeks to deliver to the audience are just fundamentally wrong, in my opinion.
Can I just put one case to you on this point of why, which obviously is undeniable. Most young people wouldn't fight for the country, and that is this: is that essentially you're talking about they can't buy houses, the country's been destroyed by mass immigration, etc. But most young people, I mean, we're talking about mythical young people. You know what I mean? Most young people, tend to agree with mass migration. And I would suggest to you that the reason they wouldn't fight for the country is actually much more to do with the fact that they think we're a terrible country. Not that we are a bleak country, but they think we are a terrible, racist, imperialist country. That's why they wouldn't fight.
That's a very, very good point. I'm glad you brought that up, because I don't necessarily disagree with you. But what I would say is that we are, all of us, a product of our time and place. And there is this idea, which I regard as being one of these kind of post-war liberal myths, that young people are naturally, young people are both naturally and duty-bound to be the most radical or rebellious element of any society. And whilst I think that there is a contingent of young people for whom that's true, I think it's a vanishingly small minority. Because I think for the most part, young people are the most conformist element of any society. And why wouldn't that be the case? Because they don't, because young people, being young people, lacking life experience, don't really know any better than what authority has told them for their entire lives. And as I was saying before, when it comes to the schools, the education system, mass media, and all the rest of it, what we've been told is that Britain is an evil, racist country, and that to be good is to be liberal and to be progressive, and what in the vernacular is now called woke. And so, on the one hand, yes, I do think that I think your point is right, that the primary reason that most young people wouldn't go to war for Britain is because they think Britain is evil. But I would say to that, well, actually, those young people are the victim of a system that has not had their best interests at heart and has essentially indoctrinated them into believing that. And so, our ruling class shouldn't be surprised when those same young people refuse to take up arms.
I agree. I mean, also, I would just add, just for context, as everyone says these days, This is a process that has been going on for a long time.
Oh, yeah.
Charlie, I think you say you were born in 2001,
That's
was
right,
it?
yeah.
Trust me, going back to the 1970s, it basically arrived in the 60s, broadly speaking. 1970s, same thing, some 80s. Essentially, the whole. It was somehow, it wasn't just simply being self-critical in a kind of healthy way. It was complete self-annihilation all the way along, and we're obviously, we are, reaping, unfortunately, the rewards of that. One thing that does interest me, you said there, that your parents took you to places, as indeed did mine, places of interest on a Sunday afternoon, things like that.
Indeed, yes.
And they had a very strong sense of what they were, and they certainly weren't kind of right-wing particularly. But you see, that might be the case for a lot of people, but how come, in your case, it crystallized into a very strong political viewpoint?
Do you know what, Peter? That's a really good question. I don't know if I actually know the answer to it.
It might not be an answer.
Yeah, I wonder if it might be a temperamental thing. I actually think, bizarrely enough, and this is a crucial element of all of this, the conversation about young people, but the COVID-19 pandemic was a period where I was at university. And I was living at university for most of the lockdowns. And so I was kind of just in this house by myself, doing my studies, but in my free time.
What was that, a university?
Yeah, that's right.
What did you do at university?
I did politics at university, surprise. But I was, in my free time, I was reading, I was listening to podcasts, I was, making sure I was still physically fit. But really, I was quite solitary. I wasn't really spending any time or socializing with anybody.
Yeah.
But to be frank with you, I really enjoyed it. And, I know that may sound a little bit insensitive because the lockdowns were a hugely negative experience for the majority of young people, especially given what it took away from them. The experience of, socializing with peers and, understanding what it means to be an adult in the wider world, transitioning from school to post school. But in that time, it was really then that I started to become properly politically aware. And it was in that time that I came to realize that almost everything I'd been taught for my entire life had been total nonsense. And it was then that these life experiences that I'd had, which previously have not had a political character, like the things I said about before, like the experience of just growing up in England, it took on a political character for me because what I realized was these are unique experiences particular to a very specific time and place and a product of a very particular people. And that's the crucial thing, is the people part of it, because these things don't come from nowhere. They are a product of thousands of years of tradition, of culture. And so it was that really, the uniqueness of Britishness and of British culture and of Britain as a country and as a land that really made me, it made me realize that this is a place that's deeply special and deeply beautiful and worth preserving.
Were you sort of aware, like when you were at school, university, yeah, maybe, but school, were you aware of this kind of sort of hostility towards the country and its history particularly?
It wasn't something I thought about, to be honest, because as I say, I didn't really become political until I was about 18. And, during school, I was more concerned with, playing Minecraft and Call of Duty and, talking to my friends on Discord and all this sort of thing. I wasn't thinking about politics. Yeah. And really, I was one of those people who I kind of was able to just coast by in school. I didn't, study and all that sort of thing to a huge degree. And I wasn't really thinking about school that much, but I did reasonably well anyway. Right. And that's just one of those things, I guess I'm lucky in that regard. But no, I never really at the time noticed the anti-British nature of our education system. What I did feel was, I remember when I was growing up a number of times, I would say things like, I hate this country. I remember saying those words when I was growing up. And I remember especially thinking that my local town centre, I won't say where that is because I don't want to dox myself, but my local town centre, I remember everybody used to say that it was a dump. And to be honest with you, it is, and it still is. And it's gotten worse over the last few years, noticeably, palpably. And people would say that, and I would then, I guess, extrapolate that to, this country's rubbish, and, there's nothing to be proud of here, and all the rest of it. And I'm sure that the education system was in some way feeding into that sense. But it wasn't something I became aware of until, as I say, I was, about 18, when I started to realise actually things could be better. It wasn't always this way in this country. Whilst I haven't known anything different, there was a time where it wasn't like this.
Well, it's interesting because you say, because that's extremely familiar, this country's dumping everything. People, I think there's a danger that people turn against the country when, so many bad things are done to it and by the government of the country.
Yeah.
As I think Peter Hitchens said once, be ashamed of your government, don't be ashamed of your country. But increasingly, I feel as someone who's been around quite a bit longer than you, is that the idea of Britain and England and what it is, it has to basically I have to hold it in my head.
Yes.
This is something, and I think that a lot of people who maybe are watching now would sympathise with that view. That people, this country, it's not worth it. I'm going to go off to Australia, things like this, or whatever. But really, you sort of feel like saying, actually, do you know that this country has got these most wonderful things? It is a terrible time, but it's not actually the country's fault. But, you can slip over into starting to think it is the country's fault if you're not careful.
Yeah, well, and the fact of the matter is the lived reality of most people, not just young people, but especially young people, is not of a beautiful, ancient homeland. Yeah. It is of a kind of almost Soviet feeling, grey, brutalist.
Brutalist,
miserable, rainy place. And so when people don't know anything different to that, I don't blame them for coming down on this country like people do. But again, I think the key thing when it comes to young people is to regard us, sure, we are called the snowflake generation and we're decried as woke and all the rest of it. What I will say is the majority of young people are not radically progressive or left-wing or liberal. They are probably on balance more liberal than their parents and grandparents, sure. But actually the desires of most young people are not unreasonable. We basically just, and of course there is a small contingent of young people who are radically liberal, left-wing, progressive and all the rest of it. And those are the people that you see at Just Stop Oil marches and Pride marches and everything else. But that is a minority of young people, because I would say that maybe 4 out of 5 young people just want to own a house, just want to start a family, just want to work a job that they feel a sense of dignity in doing, that they feel they're getting a fair day's pay for, that they're not being excessively taxed at the end of the day for.
Yeah.
And really that's no different to our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, stretching back into the mist of time. Because the desires of the Englishman have never really changed. We just want to feel at home. We want to feel that we are among our own, and that there is a sense of safety, a sense of community, a sense that we are in a place that we belong. And that's the crucial thing, if I may, very quickly, when it comes to young people, is that sense of belonging has never, ever existed for us at scale. We might have felt a sense of belonging in our families, although with that being said, family breakup for my generation is vastly more common than in previous generations. But we might have felt a sense of belonging in family, possibly in local community to an extent. I know I did. It was something I was very lucky to have when I was growing up. I had a very sort of tightly knit local community. But beyond that, there was no sense of national community, no sense that you are part of a people, part of something greater than yourself.
Yeah.
Because that national community has been fundamentally and systematically deconstructed in the aftermath of the Second World War from kind of the 1960s onward, as you said. It's been deconstructed as something, if it does exist, then it's evil. But actually, it doesn't really exist at all. Britishness is not something that you can actually pin down and define. It's just kind of, it's in the ether and all the rest of it. And actually, that sense of belonging, I may be decried as being some kind of softy for saying that I want to feel like I belong and that I want to feel safe and that I want to feel a sense of identity and purpose in my own country. But actually, these are things that were taken for granted for previous generations because they hadn't been stripped of them. Whereas I have never known that. I've never known that experience.
No, this is why it is so obviously mutual friends of ours, younger guys, feel the same way. And to me, it's always extraordinary and actually a cause of optimism that, in fact, having never experienced these things and actually having grown up in the opposite, that you can actually feel what you do.
Oh, yes.
And I think that is extraordinary. One thing, we're talking about young people. You also wrote a column in the Mail about this survey that came out a while ago about how young people would be quite happy, or should I say maybe not happy, to in fact have a dictator in Britain rather than what we have now. And you wrote saying, I believe that you could understand this particular response.
That's right. Yeah. So yes, so this was a poll that came out of Channel 4 that suggested that the majority of under 30s would be quite happy for democracy in Britain to be done away with in favour of a dictator. And I think there's a number of elements to consider with that statistic. The first is, of course, the demographic question, because, obviously an increasing number of under 30s were not born in Britain, right? And so there is this kind of foreign appetite for dictatorship, I would say. We won't go down that road, but I think that is one element of this.
Oh, I see. You mean just the demography has made a difference to that?
Yeah, I think without doubt. But if we assume that same statistic applies to young British people, which I think it probably more or less does, in my own anecdotally, I think that there is a real kind of disaffection with democracy. And the point that I made in that article was, look, it's understandable given how failed we have been by the present system in all the ways that I've already spoken about today: housing, energy, jobs, etc., family, community, nationhood, identity, all of these things. We look at the power structure that governs us, and it's delivering on none of them. Quality of life is deteriorating in this country. We look around at the high streets and see boarded up shops and litter and graffiti and the rest of it. And so it's no surprise that you then look to the system that's presiding over that decline and say, well, what is the point of this system if this is what it's delivering? Now, I'm not going to come out in favour of dictatorship, because I think that there are still ways in Britain that we can rescue the country through democracy. But actually, one thing I will say is what I'm more concerned about personally is quality of leadership. And quite frankly, the way that leadership gets to the position, gets to the decision-making position, I'm not overly concerned about, because actually I think that Britain is approaching a moment where leadership is going to be the principal question. Because all things of national concern flow downstream from leadership. And I think the quality of leadership is crucial. The ability, Carlyle is a real political influence of mine, Thomas Carlyle, the Victorian writer. And in his On Heroes, Hero Worship and the Heroic in History, he lays out essentially what a great man of history looks like, a true leader looks like. And he identifies a number of characteristics that these people have. And it's the principal one is authenticity and integrity, a real sense that this is not an act, but you are actually quite genuinely committed to your principles and committed to the well-being of the nation. And then downstream from that are things like integrity, resilience, and a sense of divine purpose, the sense that you are doing something actually for a higher cause. And democracy has not delivered a leader like that, certainly for as long as I've been alive. And really, that's the kind of leadership that I think Britain needs right now. And whether the democracy will be able to deliver that, I don't know. Trump maybe in America is an example of a nascent kind of great man of history type figure in the way that he's governing.
Yes.
But obviously it's not been all good so far.
Well, it's not just that. I think the thing is with Trump, he has at his disposal executive directives. What are they called now?
Executive orders.
Yeah, executive orders. And basically he can therefore just sign along the dotted line. Simply cannot do this. This is the odd thing about this country. I think the point's been made that America is like essentially a monarchy. We're more like a republic, but with a king.
Yeah, it's quite backwards, Winry.
It's back to front. Just before we leave this dictatorship thing, I think it was sort of assumed, I don't know, actually, it was assumed that people were thinking of some kind of right-wing dictator. But my immediate thought, actually, is that basically, because I find, and I'm sorry, I look at people of your generation, essentially, in their general attitudes, very puritanical, very, very moralistic, and also just, on the left, on the whole, they would be, what they really meant was a Stalinist type figure.
Well, that's quite possible.
Do you make any assumptions about what they mean?
I think that there's certainly a contingent of young people who would certainly welcome a left-wing dictator, because they are so thoroughly, they have been so thoroughly propagandized, and they've so thoroughly bought into the state-approved, regime-approved narrative on reality. Because that's the point. That's what's, and I try and explain this to people, not always successfully. But I say, when your so-called cause is bought and paid for and approved of by not just the British state, but every major corporation, every major media company, every charity, every university, the civil service itself, then you're not a radical. You are the foot soldier of the power structure without even realizing it. And that's a brilliant trick that our system plays, is it sells young people the idea of radicalism, the kind of sexy, interesting rebelliousness of it, but it sells it to them in a bought and paid for package, like Just Stop Oil, for example, whose goals in no way differ to those of the British state, on climate, for example, or indeed BLM. Once again, the goals of BLM in no way differ to those of the universities or the NGOs. And so there is this, this containment of radical energy in young people. And so for that contingent, sure, I think that a left-wing dictator would be desired. But once again, I sincerely believe that the majority of young people, whilst it's true that the majority of under 30s voted for Labour last year, I think part of that was exasperation. Part of that was because the media was telling everybody Labour was going to win anyway. And the polls were also suggesting that Labour was going to win, which are both kind of opinion-forming tools. But actually, again, I will bring it back to, maybe it's young men. I think it's young men more so. It's more so the case for young men, but most young men are just normal. You know, they just want a family and a house and all the rest of it.
But Charlie, why do you think it is that you have now got this extraordinary divide? You talk about young men, and basically when we're talking about people who maybe are a little bit more radical on the right, it is always, or pretty much, young guys. Women, entirely the opposite way. Why? Why do you think?
That's a really interesting one. I mean, I think that there is once again, a growing contingent of young women who want a traditional life, who are conservative in temperament and look at the lives that their grandmothers may have had, for example, where they were homemakers first and foremost, and mothers. You know, being a mother was their career, essentially. They look at that as an aspiration. I mean, I'm lucky enough to be engaged to a girl who feels that way. And
date yet?
Yes, it's October. Which is very
lovely.
And so there is a growing contingent of young women who feel far more, you know, if we want to use the right-wing, left-wing thing, then we would say that they are on the right, certainly in their attitudes, in their kind of social and cultural beliefs, in the way they view the world, you know, in its essence.
Yes.
But it is also true that there is a huge contingent of very left-wing young women. And what I think that is basically a hijacking of the natural female proclivity towards agreeableness and towards care, nurture, and all the rest of it. It's been hijacked by this ideology that does not have their best interests at heart. It is prepared to exploit their nature against them, and in service to a pathological, flattening ideology that views basically any degree of hierarchy as being something evil. And once again, I believe this comes out of the post-war kind of moral paradigm, where any degree, you know, as I say, any degree of hierarchy is viewed as something oppressive, something evil, something to be torn down and destroyed, because equality is the most important moral principle for the people who have been taken in by this ideology. But something else I would say, as I've said already, is that a lot of these young women are not, you know, they didn't choose to be born in this time. They didn't choose to be put through an education system that would fill their heads with these ideas. And so we can't view these people as, you know, apart from in the extreme examples, these people are not perpetrators. These people are victims. These people are victims of a system that doesn't have their best interests at heart, and who are parroting the narrative of this system because it's all they've ever known. It's all they've ever been taught by authority figures. And so why would they believe anything different? And so what I would say is it is the duty of young men to lead these young women out of this ideology, because actually there is a better way. A better life is possible, because the entire project of feminism, really, when it comes down to it in 2025, what has the outcome been? Well, it's been essentially the capitalist class being able to exploit the labour of women just as much as men, if we want to use Marxist language. You know, it's meant that women are, the age of marriage is increasing. I think it's now 30, you know, you're in your 30s before you get married on average now. The age of childbirth is increasing. The birth rate is decreasing. The number of marriages that end in divorce now sits at about 41%. And these are all things that are downstream from the fact, I think, among other things, that young women have been sold the idea that the most important thing in their life will be their career, which I find to be just almost an unbelievable prospect, because a lot of these left-wing young women will use the language of socialism. They'll use the language of Marx and all the rest of it without realizing that in championing their career, in championing the so-called liberation to work, they are in fact serving the interests of the very same capitalist class that they're seeking to tear down when they use their socialist rhetoric. And that's the case for so many other things as well. Mass migration, for example. So many of these left-wing young people will champion immigration and the diversity that it brings, without realizing that actually the kind of mass migration we've had to Britain for the last 30 years, all it's done is suppress the wages of workers, expand the pool of workers, and make life worse for those most vulnerable in our societies, because the effect of the massive explosion in population that we've had has, as with any destabilizing element in a society, affected the working class disproportionately as against everybody else. Well, like those northern towns I was talking about before.
Yes, with working class people, I think the institutions, all different kinds of institutions, are particularly important And when they are sort of taken away, there's often nothing. There's nothing to cushion the blow. I mean, the middle class people, I always think this when you talk about drug taking and stuff, middle class people always do have traditionally a cushion of, wealth.
Yes.
And essentially it's always going to be, the edge is going to be taken off. But it's not the case with working class people.
Yes.
I think it's undoubtedly true. You mentioned there as well, you said, that when we were talking about dictatorships and all of that, you mentioned that, in fact, you still think, democracy, that's where you put your trust, as it were. How do you see it now? I mean, we're talking after a period, where we've had this kind of turbulence with the Reform Party, which seems to, actually, that's the point I can ask, there's been this sort of distinction made between the country and the online right. Are you online right? Are you the online right? Are you part of the online right?
Well, this is a funny one. So I am a child of the internet. I will certainly say that. I spent my entire life playing computer games. I mean, my dad raised me on a diet of, Nintendo 64 games, like Mario and Zelda and all the rest of it. If this means anything to you, Peter. No offense. But I have always been drawn to technology. For all my teenage years, I was into computers, building computers, playing computer games, and spending time on the internet. I grew up on YouTube, basically. And do you know what? I wouldn't have had it any other way, because I had a great childhood and I enjoyed what the internet was able to offer me. As much as the internet and social media are decried today, I had a great time. And maybe that's because the internet was a very different place when I was, coming up, when I was in my teenage years. That's possible. And maybe it's also because my parents were very, very strict on it as well. I think that's definitely a factor. But actually, I think, this distinction between the online right and the real right, I don't know if it's all that valid, because as much as I spend a lot of time on the internet, I'm not going to deny that, probably too much time. I'm often criticized by my aforementioned fiance for being on my phone all the time. So maybe I do spend too much time on the internet and reading articles and scrolling on X and everything else. But actually, in my case, for example, I write for the Daily Mail, and that's read by hundreds of thousands of people in the real world. So, if that's not real life, then I don't really know what is.
Yes.
And so perhaps there is, I think there is certainly an element of the right who are, they place too much investment in what goes on the internet, because it's true that the majority of people don't know or care about what's happening online. But at the same time, X, for example, that's where political discourse happens in 2025. That's where all the politicians are. It's where all the thought leaders are. It's where all the writers and the writers are.
And you could actually say that, for example, the whole thing with Elon Musk grabbing on to the rape gangs issue.
Yes.
That was a perfect example, was it not, of the internet actually then, in a massive way going mainstream with the thing. So there is that. But okay, all right. I think, when people talk about the online right or whatever, I think they're talking about a relatively small number of people.
But it's always, if I may, very quickly, Peter, it's always going to be a relatively small number of people who are interested in politics. I think this idea that it is everybody's duty to be interested in politics and to follow politics and to be invested in all the rest of it. I think that's actually deeply misguided, because I think we've seen what happens when you politicize the entirety of society. And that was what happened during lockdown, when you saw when politics became front and center and unavoidable for everybody. What that did to people is it drove them absolutely crazy, because you saw people on the one side who went down the rabbit hole of the kind of, I don't want to use the term conspiracy theory, because I think that's essentially that's the language of the regime, right? But you know what I'm getting at, the people who did go down a bit of a rabbit hole and went a little bit strange. And then on the other end, you had those people who were like, give me 10 vaccines, I'll wear 10 masks, I'm never going to go outside again, long COVID and all the rest of it. That's what politicization actually does to people, because most people are not wired to be constantly thinking about politics. But most people have more important considerations, like putting food on the table, putting clothes on their children's back and all the rest of it.
I have to say that my experience, I totally agree. With lockdown, I came to different conclusions, depressing ones actually about people. But anyway, before that, Brexit, when you had the whole of the political class saying one thing.
Yes.
I knew of so many examples of people who went out, ordinary people, working class people, went out to actually find out what the whole thing was about.
Yes.
Going to their local libraries. I know it sounds corny today, but they did. Basically, I've got to find out about this. And sure enough, 18 million people would have voted. To me, that was a popular vote. That was a real uprising in the cleanest and most democratic way, and that's why it was, well, they tried to stamp on it afterwards, as we know.
And succeeded, by the way.
Yeah, yes, well, quite. But on this point, then you're looking at the kind of landscape now. Where would you put your trust now when it comes politically? I mean, we're becoming sort of right up to the what you might call the daily, everyday life of politics. But are you politically homeless now, or what?
It's a really good question, Peter. And I don't know if I've made my mind up yet, because I have been in the orbit of Reform UK for a number of years now. So when I was at university, I did an internship with them, during which time I campaigned for Richard Tice, and I met a number of people who are still on the inside of the party now. And then over the years, I still kind of remained in their orbit. I was involved in their general election campaign last year, and I am a member of the party as we speak. With that being said, I mean, the tumult over the last month or so involving Rupert Lowe has been extremely demoralising from my perspective, because what it has said to me is, this party that I was placing my faith in as a young person, looking at the prospects of this country and the trajectory that it's headed on, because Peter, I know you and I agree on this, but I think in 20, 30, 40, 50 years time, this country could be in serious trouble. I mean, it's in serious trouble now, but
I think without question.
Yeah. And the country that I may well bring children into is, it almost doesn't bear thinking about the way this country may look when they are my age, that I am now. And so with that said, I was looking at Reform UK and the populist sentiment that they've been able to tap into and succeeded, thus far in capturing. And then the way that this whole argument between Rupert Lowe and Nigel Farage has bubbled over into this very kind of lowbrow kind of insult slinging match. It just doesn't bode well, really, from my perspective. It doesn't bode well for, given the state that the country's in, and given the fact that we are actually very much on a kind of ticking time bomb as a country. The way I see it, 2029, if indeed that is when the election ends up being, it may be earlier, it may even be later by some unforeseen circumstance like war, for instance. That really, to me, looks like one of, if not the final opportunity to save this country democratically. And I don't say that lightly, because I think that the demographic reality is such that future elections will be very much influenced by, for example, foreign, e.g. Middle Eastern concerns. And also the number of people leaving. The number of young people, for example, that want to leave. Because that's the other side of this that we haven't talked about.
Well, I was going to ask you, don't worry. Yeah. I mean, but first things first. So essentially, we're looking at this now, and the situation is going to basically deteriorate.
Yeah.
Do you think that it is... Do you think we're at a position now, which is something I was thinking about very much this week, where it's not actually necessarily a party, but that there might be someone in one of those parties that you think, oh no, he is... I mean, I think Rupert Lowe, for example, had a lot of that following. I sense that Generic has it too. Do you think that it's worthwhile actually saying, right, well, look, I like that guy. He might go to Reform, for all we know. He might stay in the Tory party, but I'll follow him or her or whoever it might be.
Well, as I said before, I am a student of Thomas Carlyle, and his thesis on the way that history actually moves is that it is the biography of great men. And I think basically Britain is just waiting for that great man to emerge. And I think that, for instance, Rupert Lowe, he does actually have some of those qualities. He has a real, and I don't know him well, but I've met him a number of times. There's a real authenticity and a real sincerity to him that is extraordinarily rare among our political class. And so I think that just, your thesis there that you were just laying out, I basically think, yes, I think that the British are waiting for their hero. They're waiting for their leader to make himself known. And I think for many people, that person is Nigel Farage, rightly or wrongly. I'm still undecided on Farage personally. I think that he occupies the most important position in British politics right now, which is to say he is the leader of the right for all intents and purposes. And the fact that he's using that position not to build a movement, or rather the so-called movement he is building, to me seems quite superficial, because there's no philosophy or policy behind it or underpinning it. The fact that thus far that position has been not treated with the seriousness that I think it should be treated with, I don't know, it concerns me. But then there is also the democratic reality, if you want,
Yeah.
of the fact that we live in a first past the post system, and perhaps reform is the right centre of gravity. Perhaps it has to be reform in order to break through this two-party system. So I don't know. I mean, Robert Jenrick, you raised as well, is again somebody who I don't know well, but who I have met and spoken to in the past. Strikes me as somebody who is, whether he is authentically motivated or not, he is at least prepared to have the conversation about what actually needs to be done in this country, on everything from, migration to culture to energy and everything else. And so I don't know. I think that we live in such a time of such chaos and such upheaval that we are, that any predictions are I think it's misguided to make predictions, to be honest, at this moment, because I think anything is possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is what causes people real anguish, is this dilemma. On the one hand, they have concerns about reform, but on the other hand, they think they're lingering in the back, this might be, the only chance to break this uniparty thing. Or maybe they are part of the uniparty, and trying to come to some kind of conclusion causes people a lot of angst.
Yes.
I mean, or should I say people on our side, it causes a lot of angst. You mentioned there as well about people leaving. I'm assuming you would never leave Britain.
No way. Never.
Never. No.
Never. Under any circumstances, and I don't say that lightly.
No.
Because this is my homeland, and it's my duty as an Englishman to protect it.
Yes.
And whatever form that takes. Yeah. And, and again, I really do, and I don't say this lightly either, I look at the way this country is going, and I think that, the Troubles, which I, thankfully, was not alive to experience, I think the Troubles are going to look like a picnic compared to what's coming in the next 50 years in this country. And I don't say that with any degree of glee or joy. I just think that it's just the reality of the situation. And I think that if something isn't done in the next 10 years to seriously change the course of this country, I think something like mass civil unrest or indeed civil war is all but inevitable. And I'm not saying that as it being something good or desirable. It's just my take on what's actually the direction that we're heading in. And that fills me with fear.
Yeah, absolutely. What role would you be playing? I mean, it sounds like an interview, isn't it? Sorry, it's not an interview. But how do you see your career going? I mean, you are a commentator, you're writing columns to the Daily Mail, very involved in the sort of swirl of politics. I mean, do you want to be a politician? I mean, do you want to do that?
Well, it will probably come as no surprise to learn that for a number of years I have certainly had political ambition.
Yeah.
But relatively recently, I have decided that actually I'm not wedded to any particular job title. I don't. For a while, I wanted to be an MP or whatever, an elected member of government. But actually, now my view is, well, whatever, if you want, whatever path God lays out before me, I will just walk, and I hope, continue to make the right decisions when decisions are necessary, and wherever that leads me, I will be happy, because I think that too many people. The type of person whose chief motivation is achieving elected office is exactly the wrong person to have in office. Because, I mean, weirdly, that is the type of person democracy selects for, is the type of person who's good at winning elections and who is prepared to make the compromises, both personally and professionally, to get elected. Whether that means taking money from people who, for whom you then need to say the right words, or compromise on your own personal moral convictions on, issues of policy or whatever else. It is the case that democracy selects for those types of people in leadership roles. But, from my perspective, if I am led to run for office, if I am led to a directly political career, so be it. But if not, so be that as well.
But you say led, not splitting hairs here, but it's also a matter of temperament.
That's true.
Right? So, but essentially, if you are in the kind of the world of commentating or think tanks or do all these sort of things, it can be very powerful. You write some good books, whatever, very, very powerful in that way. But somehow there will always be this kind of, with some people, there will always be this kind of niggling instinct to actually do,
Well, I can't deny that just, on from what I've said already, that I feel a very, very profound sense that time is ticking and that we don't have long to save this country, and that if those of us who are motivated to don't step up, then we will have neglected our duty. I mean, I really do. I'm a man of faith, and I believe that we are all placed here for a purpose. And I think that those of us who are drawn to, it's not just drawn to politics, but it's drawn to questions of, questions of morality and nature and reality and the way that the world should be. It is the duty of those of us who are drawn to those kinds of ideas and conversations,
yes,
to actually put our money where our mouth is, if you want to, if you want. And again, I'm not going to deny that I've had thoughts in the past of having a political career. And I won't deny that it certainly sounds appealing. And I really do feel a strong sense of duty, because something else that I spoke about in my most recent Mail article is the fact that I did actually apply to join the army when I left university.
Oh, right.
It was my ambition.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, it was
migrants or something?
That's right, yeah. So it was my ambition to be an officer in the British Army since my mid-teens. It was something that I was always very much drawn to for a number of reasons. It was the lifestyle itself, the physical demands, because I'm a very physically active person, the strategizing, the leadership skills, the organizational skills that it outfits one with, and also the sense of serving king and country. Now, that final point there, I think, is less clear nowadays that we have this utterly corrupt political class. But all the rest of it still appeals to me. And, the overriding sense was one of duty. It was a sense that I have to do this, that I would be neglecting neglecting my duty if I don't do this.
Yeah.
And now, I was, as you say, I was rejected from the army, unfortunately, which was very annoying and upsetting at the time, because I occasionally experienced mild migraines, which actually speaks to the box-ticking, red tape nature of army recruitment. Interestingly, off the back of my article, the deputy head of army recruitment reached out to me and said that he would like to help me with my application, which I thought was...
Oh, really? On the back of that? Really?
So I don't know whether I will pursue
Would you
that.
still do it then? Would you still go in the army?
Well, I stick by everything I said in my article, because I really do think that anybody who is prepared to serve this political class is allowing the wool to be pulled over their eyes. But at the same time, on the other hand, everything else I said, the lifestyle, the skills that it outfits one with, I think are very much, I still desire those things. But that sense of duty that really led me to seeking a military life, I still feel that very deeply. But it's just, I've just shifted from military to politics. And and as I say, I feel a sense of duty. I feel like I would be, I wouldn't be able to live with myself. I can't bring myself to do anything else, outside of what I do now. And I feel like I am in the right place at the right time, doing the right thing, which really is all anybody can ask for, I would say, in life. And so, as I say, if I am led, and when I say if I am led to, a political career, what I mean by that is, essentially, I'll use religious language. If God leads me in that direction, then so be it. But actually, I'm not the type of person who, I'm not going to pursue a political career as the be all and end all, because I think, again, the type of person who does that is exactly the wrong person to be in office.
Yes, well, we're, 5 minutes from Westminster House of Parliament? Full of those creatures.
It absolutely is. Yeah. And actually, but with all that being said, if no one else is going to do it, then it is the duty of those of us who are prepared to.
I think this sense of duty compulsion, I think is something you're hearing more and more, and not just from people of your age, actually. It's interesting that...
But I think you feel that way, if I may.
Yeah, I mean, people like, you mentioned Ben... not Ben Hadby, Rupert Lowe.
Yeah.
He's fine. He doesn't need it. He's fine for money, all of this stuff. And so it's actually quite a new venture for him. So I think that's good. Well, look, Charlie, whatever happens, all the best with it.
Thank you.
I mean, you've been on this channel before, but on the DD programs. Yes. And can you stay with us just a couple of questions for our exclusive members, as it were. But in the meantime, thanks very much indeed. Thank you, Charlie Downs.
Cheers.
Charlie Downs. And we shall see you next week. In the meantime, do have a good week, won't you? Bye. Our mission at the New Culture Forum is and always has been to defend and celebrate Britain's history, culture, and its people, and indeed Western civilization, at a time when both are under sustained attack. We have grown from small beginnings to become the country's most influential right-leaning cultural think tank. Our content is watched and read by some of Britain's most influential political figures. But now we need your help. If you believe in what we do, then please do become a member. For as little as £4 a month, you can make a vital contribution to what we do. As a member of the NCF family, you will help ensure that we can continue to produce quality content online, such as our 3 weekly programs, Whittle, which is our flagship interview show, Newspeak, our panel discussion show, and Deprogrammed, which is targeted at Britain's youth. As you probably know, in addition, we produce important documentaries, such as our critically acclaimed 6-part series, The West, a stunning celebration of the history and genius of Western civilization, and our ongoing documentary series, Heresies, with hard-hitting episodes tackling subjects such as immigration, gender ideology, and BBC bias. But the New Culture Forum is much more than a YouTube channel. We don't just complain about Britain as it is, we provide real solutions and clear policies on how we can push back against the madness and restore sanity to this nation. Our presenters are now highly sought after and have become familiar faces across the media. Our prestigious annual Smith Lecture and our regional and indeed national conferences have attracted world-class speakers. Perhaps most importantly, we are the only organisation on the right of politics that has launched a national movement without actually being a political party. And uniquely, through our NCF Locals programme, we've established some 30 active branches in towns and cities right across the nation, from Edinburgh to Exeter, and with many more on the way. We're very proud of what we've achieved, and our members have made it possible. In return, our members receive access to exclusive content, invitations to private events, free or discounted tickets to our conferences and lectures, free copies of our books, and much more. I very much hope that you'll join us too by clicking the link in the description or going to our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Now is the time that we need your help. Thank you.